in a research system.
Can you tell us some of the things?
Of course, like I was saying, the Brazilian government invested in a national research system. Embrapa, the organization I'm within, is a part of, but we're not by ourselves. There's private sector's representatives. We have universities, federal universities, private universities. And of course, Embrapa is a big part of that. And coming from 1973, when Embrapa was created, we have been able to develop about 9,000 different technologies so far and have about registered 300 new cultivars that are adapted to our soils, to our climate. And if I can just go back to one point, I was reading an OCP policy brief this morning. It's about agriculture, was released last March. And it says that agricultural growth in Africa is mainly driven by increasing labor of land. And this is okay, but of course we have to have the technological component. And that's where I guess Brazilian experience can help, because you cannot exhaust land and you have a limited labor force. So technology is very important to fill this gap and allow larger productivities, large yields.
And I'll come back to you a little bit later about how the technologies that in some cases you invented can help here in Africa. But before I do that, I wanted to go to the Minister. Minister, good to see you.
Thank you.
I know we've heard a lot of you so far today, and I wanted, though, to talk about what, for many of us, the lingering image of Gambia and agriculture is your former president wading through the rice fields, talking. That's true. But I'm going to ask you, though, about if you can tell us about what you inherited and what technologies that you're using in Gambia that would help in terms of feeding the population.
Thank you very much for having me on this forum. Gambia is one of the smallest countries in Africa, and it's only one of the countries that has no mineral resources. We depend wholly on agriculture. 78% of the population are directly involved in agriculture. Therefore, and I would say fortunately or unfortunately, overthrowing the government of the First Republic, I was then the Minister of Agriculture then in 1994. And I'm back in that ministry. You used to see him saying that he owns it, belonged to the Gambian people, and it was a World Bank project, the Jahali-Pachar project. In 1993, rice is our most staple food. Gambians eat rice 3 times a day. We were producing 52% of our needs in 1993. But in 2016, we are producing 15%. So now what we're planning to do with the assistance of the international and our bilateral friends is to modernize and transform agriculture into a modern, diversify, and we have started this, whereby we can now go into asking small farmers, helping small farmers to graduate from subsistence agriculture to not only feeding their family, but having excess produce to sell and have income. And then to transform agriculture also into a mechanized, modernized agriculture so that we can interest the young people to go back to the farm. So presently we have acquired back those vast lands that the president used to take for himself and giving it back to the families that own the land. And then we are now helping them with, just 4 days ago, I was able to give 35 power tillers to the Rice Growers Association, who are mostly 85% women, to start stopping using the hoe and the chisel. And then we are now and threshing machines instead of using the hand and pounding the rice on the barrels, so that at least that the drudgery of the women will reduce. And then we are seriously going into diversification, because rice and peanuts are our main exports and our main crops. And 93, we were able to produce 263,000 tons. But in 2016, we were able to produce only 35,000 tons. So we want to now see how best we can revive that industry, because that is why because we are exporting so much of agricultural produce. Our foreign exchange was very strong, but then we had our currency to the pound. Today, you need $67 to the pound because agricultural exports have gone down drastically. Now we want to go into livestock rearing and into horticulture so that we can diversify, because most of peanuts and rice are only 5-month activities. So we want to engage the farmers into having at least 11 months of activity into sheep rearing, that is small ruminants, and into horticulture and into poultry. So if that is done, I think also Gambia being one of the now most vibrant tourist destination in West Africa, our horticultural gardeners will be able to supply all the hotels, and the livestock owners will also, because we are importing poultry needs and our horticultural needs and our livestock needs presently.
Mr. Minister, I want to move to Gordon next, but before I do that, I want to tell the audience that I want to make this very interactive, and I want to get you very much engaged in this conversation as soon as I can. But I also wanted us to use some of the technologies that are available for us through SpotMe. Unfortunately, for those of you who've been trying to use SpotMe or send out emails, you may have noticed that SpotMe and our internet is temporarily down. So we'll use some old school voting a little bit later. Questions, thinking about that as we move along. But Gordon, I wanted to ask you about your work in Africa. You've done a lot of observe in terms of technology that's being used in different parts of the continent as it relates to agriculture.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for being here. It's the first time I've been to the Atlantic Dialogues, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a scientist and an agricultural scientist, and so I think I'm in the minority of about 1 or 2 here in the audience. I absolutely agree with Adriana. We're talking about both policy and technology. And the policy is moving well in Africa. You only have to know about CADAP, for example, which I won't spell out for you, what's happened with the African Union, the Malabo Declaration, and the leadership from people like former president of, or the current president of the African was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, and transformed rice production. Nigeria is now self-sufficient in rice production because of his efforts. Now, what I've been seeing in Africa at the moment are 2 kinds of technology working. The first is that farmers with very small amounts of land, less than 2 hectares, the majority of farmers in Africa, if they have a drought-tolerant new hybrid maize, if they have a blended fertilizer, not just DAP, diammonium phosphate, which gets thrown all over Africa, but and a particular element that's maybe boron in southern Ethiopia or lime in Mozambique, if they do that, they can get 3, 4, 5 tons per hectare of maize. That's the European average, and I've seen that all over Africa. It can be done. At the moment, African farmers, if they're very lucky, get a ton. Can just you imagine if you're an African farmer, you and your forebears have been only getting 750 kilos, maybe a ton of maize per hectare, and you wake up in the morning and out there, you're 3, 4, 5 tons. That's a transformation. That's one technology transformation. The other is digital technology. You know, I think there's probably already more mobile phones than there are Africans in Africa. Pioneers of mobile phones. They've developed all kinds of systems whereby they can communicate with each other, whereby they can access seed and fertilizer, whereby they can bank. They've been in the forefront of the revolution in digital technology using mobile phones. Africans have. And the great advantage of that digital technology is it speeds up the process. So there's no reason why without digital technology, with digital technology, you can achieve that kind of growth that John was talking about earlier on. And we can talk more about that later.
Thank you very much. I've been told as you were talking, I thought for a minute that you had awakened Spot Me, but then it's down again. But we'll come back with a question in a minute. But let me go to Peter first, and maybe we'll have Spot. A lot of work on the nexus of water and energy. And what have you found, particularly as it relates to working here in Africa?
Well, let me say that we're talking a lot about policy here. And I'd like to start out with a little anecdote about the elephant and the mouse. The elephant fell in love with the mouse. And they went to the wise owl in the forest, in the jungle, and said, we've fallen in love with each other. A wise owl said, that's great, you should get married. So they ran off into the jungle. They stopped about a mile in, and they said, wait a minute, we've got to go back to the wise owl. So they say, how are we going to do this? And the wise owl said, implementation. And I think that academics are very much, we do policy, we promulgate things and say, just do it. The government agencies, the private sector, are forced with how do you actually do the things, which are probably good things to do, which we don't know how to implement. I think I've been taken with the nexus of food, energy, and water, because I've worked a lot on water, and many years of seeing people focusing on water, and I've focused on water myself. They're too focused on water. Water people see things only as water. And in fact, water use in the world is 70–80% of it goes for agriculture. And so why aren't we spending more time on having used for energy production, it's used for crop production, it's used for human health and things like that. But certainly the need to do them all together is important. And I give a little anecdote of in Morocco, actually, where the government was very interested in saving water. It's a very dry country, despite the rain, despite what happened in Casablanca, the movie. This is a very cold and wet country. The government wanted to save water on a project, and they thought they would use drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is a very good way of, quote, saving water. And they actually subsidized it very heavily for the farmers. And the farmers did it for a couple of seasons, and the government didn't save any water. And they were doing it right. And what happened was the farmers had surplus land, and they saved water on the land that they water. They grew more crops. So actually, and they pumped more water. And the government ended up paying for subsidies for irrigation and the irrigation technology, but also for energy, for pumping, and the fertilizer use that was there. So it turned out that it's who benefited from this technology. The government didn't save any water. The farmers didn't waste the water. They used it for inducing their own salary. So you end up with very complicated relationship, economic, social, and technical. And the technical change was the drip irrigation. The social change was the farmer adjusting to change in technology. And so that's a good example of why it's impossible. There's a huge amount of technology available for irrigation. But again, a lot of it is used or used badly. And I like to use the example of technology transfer of irrigation technology that occurred in the United States. And this was in 1890 when the US was starting to do irrigation out in Utah. And they didn't know how to do it, so they sent a delegation to India. And this is not very well known. The US Geological Paper #1 is written by an American engineer who went and said, how do we do irrigation? And sort of learned all the techniques. And now maybe they were bad techniques by the time we got to in the 1890s, they were state of the art. When I worked a lot in India, I found out that none of the Indians had ever seen this report, this 1890 report of the US government. They were suffering from endless US government experts coming telling them what to do. And telling them what to do with what they shouldn't be doing now in 1970, they should have been doing in 1870. And so there's that type of technology transfer, and it isn't clear who's going to do what to whom. Now, the other thing about Africa, it's a long time since on the in Africa. I worked some on the Aswan High Dam before it was built. The government had a Ministry of the High Dam, it had a Ministry of Agriculture, the Minister of Power, and the Ministry of Fisheries. And they had planned to use this. There's huge investment going into this thing. What can you do with this investment? Well, you can generate electricity, which the Ministry of Power said, we're going to use this for electricity. The Ministry of Agriculture said, we're going to use it for irrigation water, doing a lot of that. The Ministry of Fisheries said, wow, we're going to have this big lake, and let's build some fisheries, lake fisheries. Well, of course, it turns out you can't have all those three things happening simultaneously. Some of them are complementary, and I did with my colleague, we actually showed that you couldn't have, everyone in the ministries couldn't have full use of the dam. And that report went to my colleague in Cairo, and he went to the Minister of Energy and showed it to the minister, and he was immediately put under house arrest. And I had this call from my colleague from House in Cairo saying, I'm under arrest, what am I going to do? You sent me this memo. And I said, well, look, I'm just a graduate student at Harvard. I can't do much about the thing. But there was an example of, it got very close to reality, because the policy that the government thought that they were going to do all of these things, actually they couldn't do all those things. They had to do those things together. And that was an eye-opener for me. I knew that in the sense.
Thank you very much. You mentioned three things. I want to give you, ask you a question that has three options. I mentioned earlier, Spot Me continues to be down. Oh, it's up. Well, how about that? Technology might save us after all. A question for you, and then we'll ask the same question at the end of the session. Do you think that technology will save African farming? One is yes, two is no, and three, I don't know. So let's see if you can, and we should be seeing up on the board. There we go. Can technology save African farming? Yes, no, or don't know. And while you vote on that, I want to get back to Adriana, and we're talking technology. Adriana, let's talk specifics about some of the things that you're doing in Brazil that you think can easily transfer to Africa. Just give us maybe 2 or 3 examples of the technology that you're using now that you think can benefit farmers here in Africa.
Well, the first example I can think of, it's back to the basics, which is about soil fertility and the correction of acidity of the soil. Back in the 70s and 80s, we could not have agriculture in the Cerrado region, which is related to the savanna. It was a very important agricultural frontier for us. So Embrapa, along with other partners, developed a way to correct the acidity in the soil and applying limestone. That's what allowed us to grow in the Cerrado region. And these days we have cotton, we have soybean, we have rice, we have all kinds of crops being grown because of the first step was correcting the soil acidity. Another technology that I can think about, it's also related to our exponential growth in terms of production, and it's close related to what you and I were talking yesterday with Charles from the US, name, I'm sorry, but he was describing how his organization is working with African countries to help them understand how, where, and when they can grow crops. And this is very important because it allows farmers to obtain credits from banks and also crop insurance. And that's the principle that was behind what we call in Brazil agricultural zoning. And this is a very good technology that Embrapa, our Ministry of Agriculture, have been working for about 30 years, so that our entire country now has is divided into areas, and we can tell farmers, okay, this area is good for soybean, that one's for rice. you should grow this in the first semester of the year and the second, when it's raining, when it's not raining. So, and this is something together with Africa very closely.
Terrific. As you can see from the results, we have a lot of believers in the room. In terms of 70, almost 70% of the audience believes that technology can save Africa. Peter, you want to?
I want to follow up on a comment that Adriana made. You know, it's too easy for us to go and tell people what to do. And in fact, a friend of mine, we were working on Chad many years ago, and he was very interested in the agronomics. And he went with full of ideas of what farmers could grow. And he found out that one of the farmers in the area he was working in was growing 18 different species, different varieties of petit meal. You know, that he could, the farmer knew it was the drought region. You planted, you know, something, you did risk aversion by planting different cultivars in different parts of your farm. And so I'm using these 18 different species, different types. What are you recommending? And the guy said, well, I've only got 3. You know, I don't know enough about the situation, but the history was, now I'm not saying that history is everything on that, but certainly tremendous amount of local knowledge about things like crops and soils, which don't show in the Western style of communication.
Mr. Minister, I wanted to go to you, and looking at, and we've heard some talk about China here so far today. If you look at the technologies that are being used in different parts of Africa, are Africans using technology, and is this technology feed Africans or Chinese?
Because I think every government should have the responsibility of having to take care of the people who put you in position. Therefore, the Chinese, when they are coming to assist us, as much as we need the assistance, we should prepare our own policies and our own strategies, which they will help us to implement. Because if China can feed itself, whether they are 1.6 billion, I think we can learn from them. But we should do it in order to improve the lives of our own people. Therefore, the knowledge of the transfer of knowledge and technology is important. And we have just recently brought a program in Gambia with the assistance of the FAO, whereby we train farmers themselves, to go and train farmers, and we give them motor bicycles to go around training farmers on specific crops, when they are to grown, how it will be grown, and then to teach them about the weather. And of course, we are drought, you know, the weather problem is a problem in Gambia because sometimes we have droughts, sometimes we have floods. So farmers have to be very much in tune with what is happening in the climate change. Climate change is a reality. And then now we are trying to go directly to the farmer so that let the farmer take ownership. Because the moment people and tell the farmers what they should do, particularly when it comes to implementation of projects, they see the project as government project or World Bank project or IMF project or IFAD project. But when we involve the farmer from inception to ask them, they have their own input in the process of the whole project, then they took ownership. That will guarantee sustainability and continuity when the project ends. That is why the knowledge and technological transfer is a very important innovative and initiative in trying to make the farmer to be self-sufficient and to be capable.
Thank you, Minister. There are a number of people in the audience who are involved in this technological transfer in Africa, one of whom is Charles, who was telling me yesterday about his projects. Charles, you want to please identify yourself?
DC, and I'm a consultant with a company called Six Grain. In order to bring that technology to the market and to Africa, the 21st century technology, we have to understand how the farmers are working today. Basically, the small farmers with a small piece of land do whatever they were traditionally used to do without concern about the right grain or the right product to produce at that time. And they made money once a year when they sold the crop. And they would have to use that money over the 12 months period after that. Now, what is basically in partnership with NASA, it's to have a GPS, the exact GPS location and the shape of the farm with analyzing the soil, which basically we were able to design what would be the perfect crop. And to answer the question where the farmer will not follow direction and will do whatever they think they will do, we have found a way to adjust that decision. And the way we do it is because now we have information that the bank did not have before, so the farmer could never, ever dream of having. So when the bank knows what that farmer is going to produce, it has a value at that point, and the bank what the farmer is going to produce and how much money he's going to make, and it will pay the farmer on a monthly basis a portion of that revenue. So now the farmer has money on a monthly basis, and the bank has the option to tell the farmer, if you follow the program that we think is going to help you to produce 100% yield instead of 30 or 40% yield, they will pay the money. And that gives also all the other assets that once you have that information, everybody get involved. The grain manufacturer, the fertilizer distributor, the equipment machine, everybody is involved in that process.
Another question for the audience, and this time we'll use word cloud. And if you have your spot me out, the question is, and I'll also ask the same question to Gordon, why do you think Africa is so food insecure? If there's one word that comes to mind, why is Africa so food insecure? And Gordon, what do you think?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, one, of course, is infrastructure, that farmers are a long way from the market. One is lack of investment, and so on and so forth. But the point is that these can be overcome. We have a program, a very sophisticated insurance system, most sophisticated in the world, that's tied to loans that go to farmers from which they can buy the seed and the fertilizer they need to produce these high yields of crops, which we know they can do. And they've been producing those with a pilot just finished in Tanzania, and the results come up on pixels, 5 square kilometer pixels related to farmer associations. The whole program is supported by the Munich Re in terms of insurance. We have 30,000 farmers this year, and it's worked. And now they're moving to 100,000, 200, 300,000 farmers over the next 2 to 3 years. So farmers can do it, but they need the kind of support that means that if there is climate change, if there is drought, they will still get the money back in terms of what they've spent on the seed and fertilizer and so on and so forth. It doesn't work unless you've got that infrastructure support. The technology is there, they can do it.
There are some great answers behind you, everything from transportation to corruption, degradation, productivity.
Sure. But once you've got the incentives, once the market starts to work, all those things will happen. People will build roads, they will provide money. That's how development occurs.
Mr. Minister, one of the answers or thoughts from members of the audience is corruption. Does that concern you?
Not only corruption, but Africa's agriculture is backward because of conflicts, corruption, bad governance, and of course instability. In most countries where there is instability, it's the rural people that suffer most. And unfortunately, governments of Africa spend more money on their defense budget than on agriculture. Whom are we going to fight with? The Maputo Declaration said 10% of our budgets should go to agriculture. Presently, I think only 6 countries have fulfilled that. Can you imagine? Now it's over 10 years. That's why I said bad leadership, not committal to the life you are supposed to have, is what brought poverty, starvation, and instability. Bad governance. All the issues that you are having, just you mentioned today, that DR Congo is the richest, is one of the richest African countries. But how many years has DR Congo been unstable? This is Africa's problem, that we are leading, but we want to glorify leaders and personalize leadership, that we vote people into government and turn them into gods. And the biggest insult to Africa is voting an individual and saying that the individual is the only citizen who can better that country. That's an insult to a nation. People go. The country stays. How many presidents have gone? All of us will go, but our countries will stay. It's high time that the people take ownership and the destiny of their countries and hold their countries' governments accountable.
Right. That's a good point. And I want to ask a question to the audience. If anyone who wrote corruption or even degradation want to expand your thinking on that, I'd love to hear that. But before I do, I want to get Peter's take on what do you think of given your work on the continent that you might want to add?
I think it seems to me that corruption is something we live with. The political contributions are the same sort of thing. We live with it. In every country in the world has it. Some have it more, some have it less. But the thing is that the question is, can you work around it and eventually get rid of most of it? And you get around it by bringing in the private sector into the mix of government and private. And I think in terms of marketing systems between farms and the markets themselves, there's a lot of hanky-panky goes on in that chain. And the question is, can you get rid of that? And I think that's where I would...
A lot of hanky-panky? Do you want to some more about it?
Actually, I didn't use the word corruption. I used the word land degradation. I'm glad to see that it's the biggest word on that thing, because it is... You can have the best seed in the world and you can have the most fantastic blended fertilizer, but if your land is degraded, the soil becomes unresponsive. Your fertilizer is completely wasted. If you have nothing to protect that land against drought, yes, having insurance is great, but having something that protects the land and keeps it productive, even in drought years, is better. And that's where agroecological techniques like agroforestry comes in. In some places, like the Gambia, where you're blessed with a lot of water, they are nice to have. In other places, like northern Ethiopia, or Niger, or Chad, or Mali, these countries where so many young men are desperately trying to get to Europe today, you cannot grow food without either lashings of capital, which are not available, or without agroforestry, without providing that tree cover that gives you the soil organic carbon, that makes fertilizer responsive, that allows water to percolate into the soil instead of running away when the rains come, and that provides you with protection against a hot sun when for 10 months of the year the sun beats down and no rain is coming in. So I would like to ask the panel, and especially the Brazilian example, where this has been taken on board now, and where you have massive policies to promote agroforestry across the continent, why this word has not yet come up.
Thank you. Adriana?
Well, that's my fault, because it's in my notes. I was thinking, when we were saying, in Brazil we call it integrated crop livestock forestry system. It's an integrated productive system, and it's key for eco-friendly and sustainable agriculture, because it's important to recuperate the soil, but also allows farmers to have, for example, if you plant cotton, you might have another source of income if you also use your land for, let's say, dairy cattle, for example. Then you have milk, you can get a second income from that. And also you can do some consortium and some links between cotton and cattle. But also if you have forestry, that's important, like you just said, to renew the quality of the soil. So this is a huge technological development that's being pushed forward by Brazil, not only within the country, but we have some important PPPs, especially with John Deere. We have a consortium, an international consortium of companies and research institutes to advance this concept of integrated system, and we think this is very important for Africa. We have some technical cooperation projects with Africa. I'd say that in the past 15 years we had about 80 to 90 TCPs with Africa. That's a lot, but so far none within this area that would be so important for both Africa and Brazil. So I think this is an area we could work together.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Question?
Martina Kappel, I'm from True North Leadership. I worked a lot in Kenya with farmers, small-scale farmers, and I agree with the Minister, one of the elements, not just at the higher level, but at the lower level, is taking responsibility and taking ownership mindset, because very often farmers have land, but they believe that they don't have anything. So they are not always farming their land, even if it's fertile. So my question to you is, how are you looking at using technology to changing the poverty mindset of people thinking that they're poor even though they have 1 or 2 acres or more of land? Another element that I saw when I was working with people in the communities, there are big companies out giving loans, one of them 1 acre fund, and in Kenya they are seen as lands. But what I see is that they give loans and they want the farmers to pay back the loans before they've actually to having maize. Now maize is a very low income crop, and it normally leads to poverty if you don't have much land. So what I experienced was that people become poor sometimes when big cooperatives go into the land and help the farmers. So it's an anti-development aid, you could say, to give those loans. I'm sure there's a way that even technology can help with that, to survey some of these issues. So yeah, those are 2 of the things. I have experienced how farmers can increase their, by just changing their mindsets, no money involved at all, just their own potential, that they can increase their income by 3 to 20 times, not percent, but times, and that the health has increased incredibly. So,
Mr. Minister,
agriculture.
The poverty mindset?
Yes, that's right. I think this is a very, very important question. And I think the best way to solve that problem is this knowledge and technical transfer to the farmer himself or herself, whereby they will know that this belongs to them. That is why recently we have now grouped the farmers, and as I said, we give them their power tillers, and now we are giving them even milling machines and threshing machines so that the women can stop the pounding, the drudgery that they are doing. At least 2 cups or 1 cup, which they keep. When they have a full bag, they sell it and maintain the money for the maintenance of the machine. And then this is going on now in few of the societies. And I've seen that they are now, because of the power tillers and the machine and the equipment, they are growing far more than what they used to grow. We can feed their families, and then the excess is being sold. So they are empowered. So I think this is the only way. Let the farmers be part and parcel of every process that is meant for their benefit. Let them not see it or giving them charity. It's their rightful owner. As I was going when I went on tour recently, everybody wants to thank me. I said, no, don't thank me. When you elected me, they gave me a new car. And it's from your taxes. So we have to make them more aware of the citizens' rights and responsibilities and their tough relationship to the elected personalities, be a president, minister, councillor, or anybody. I think that's the only way that we can empower them and make them take full responsibility of their destiny.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. There's a question back here.
In the spirit about, I'd like to underscore the role of energy. Nobody has mentioned that. We talked about food losses. In storage and in the production side, and renewable energy in particular give a hope for off-the-grid farms that may not have access to grid technology. Can this be explored, and what are the bottlenecks to really achieving that?
Professor?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because storage accounts for the food losses account for 30% of the production about globally. And it's post-harvest in the developing world, and it's the post-consumer in amount of, that's a huge loss of water, fertilizer, energy, the whole thing. And I think the minimize water use or energy use or something, but think in terms of maximizing the value of production. And you see, what we're proposing in some of our work is that we use more energy in the rural systems. We use refrigerated trucks in the harvesting of fruit and vegetables. And you take the refrigerated trucks directly to the market. You avoid the storage issue, the handling of the things. So you get to the market, you go to an area where you open the back of your truck and you've got a supermarket. You sell directly to the local poor in the cities, bypass the supermarket chains, and you use, now that takes a lot of energy to keep a refrigerated truck running in the field and all the way through to things. Social benefits of getting improved diets to the poor, and also improved income to the farmers. And typically you find the value added goes up as you go down the food chain. From the farmer might get 30 cents a kilo for his produce, and it's selling for $3.40 a kilo in the cities. And so squeezing that thing and using technologies that would do that would involve the ability for farmers to get more income, and it would solve some of the problems of rural poverty that we see. So we think you can use the food storage issue to force to distribute the income and the value much better.
In Uganda, there's 4 friends who got together and they've built a store. And farmers deliver maize to various collection points, and the maize is taken to the store and it's fumigated, it's cleaned, it's graded and kept in the store. But it still belongs to the farmers. So when somebody wants to buy the grain, for example, the World Food Programme would come along to the grain store and will sit with the farmers, not with the owners of the store, and bargain and get a... So it's a really good, fair system, and it's a transparent system. All the farmers have to do is to pay the... And there aren't any. There's one maize store in the whole of Uganda. It's a very good example of what you can do with just some kind of investment in agricultural agribusiness.
Thank you very much. Question?
I am Landry Signé, and I'm a senior fellow at the OCP Policy Center. So many of the technological solutions are well known, including the policy one. You have many programs at the national level and at the continental level, including the CADEP, the Common Agricultural Development Program. So I would like to know, what do you think could be done to reduce which are created, and their successful implementation, both in the public and private sector. Thank you.
Adriana, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, I don't think I'm in a position to say what Africans should do or shouldn't. But I say based on our experience, like I said, you need a commitment from the government, from the highest level possible. And from this commitment, you have funding. So I think the key, you have to have financial resources, invest in people. That's something very important that I haven't mentioned earlier. But people are key. Develop your own technology. So I say the first thing is governmental commitment for the country. Of course, thinking about, again, of the Brazilian reality, international cooperation was important for us. We received aid. I particularly don't like this word. I prefer cooperation, but we received foreign aid from America, from Japan, from Europe. But if the country itself doesn't own that, then we go back to what we were saying earlier about ownership. If the country itself doesn't commit to it, it doesn't have money from other countries, from other agencies or other organizations. On the long run,
by and talk to our new friend, the new face of agriculture and farming in Africa. And I'm sure that as you listen to the session, I'm sure that you have some observations that might be of use to the rest of us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I definitely have. In the space that I work in within Nigeria, I'm certainly not a smallholder farmer. And I think that a lot of policy is directed in that direction. And a lot of attention isn't given to even within these African nations. We've hired college graduates that have time. I've got a young lady who studied fish management. She can't tell me anything other than catfish, and that's the reality of the education that's happening in our country. And I think what aligns with so many other economic issues we have, as well as in agriculture, is this connection to research and development, which is not happening. You know, I've had an opportunity to work with drone technology and remote sensing in relation to agriculture, and the technology is applicable in Western world, in Europe, but there's no research on African crops. So now we have this technology that can we don't have the information to actually apply it to our crops. So I think policy needs to also take into account a changing model for the people getting into agriculture. And I don't think that happens. It focuses a lot on those who are existing and trying to increase their productivity, but doesn't take into account those who are going to enter the agriculture sector as well. So,
thank you very much. Mr. Minister, I wanted to answer that question, or to respond to what he said, but also in the context of, are there enough being taught in the schools, the young people, to be able to take full advantage of this new era that we're entering, one that Obi has talked so much about?
Being taught in our schools about this transfer of technology, particularly in agriculture. I think countries should take it up seriously and make sure that they start teaching about these issues, even at the primary stage, growing up, so that the interest will grow in the young people, so that before they leave school, they're more interested in being changes in the lives of the people where they belong, because most of the people in the schools are from rural families, and these are the people who are the agriculture. I always tell people also, I have never, okay, sometimes it is in other countries, but in Gambia, I have not seen in England be up to the Director of Agriculture and retiring and going back to agriculture. So people will say that, you know, he was an official, but he doesn't want to be an agriculturist. So they leave the agriculture with the rural folks. I think it will be interesting for governments to start introducing in their curricula, in their schools, about these things.
Thank you.
John?
Okay, Adriana, quickly.
Okay, if I may just, I think the point raised by you in your last question is very interesting, because usually we think about people going away from the rural areas, going to the cities, and we think that we should stop that. But your question is on the other industry attractive, so we can bring this. I don't have an answer, a proper answer for that, but maybe we should start thinking the way you put your question, so we can help with this.
Question?
Hi, I am the correspondent in Brazil for the Financial Times, and I mean, the question is a bit far-fetched, but it was probably far-fetched in Brazil 25 or 30 years ago, when Brazil was an importer of food. Now Brazil is supposed to be the world's breadbasket. Brazil has like highly mechanized agriculture in certain areas. As you said, Adriana, areas in Mato Grosso that were not suitable for soya, today are the soya capital of the world. But there is increasingly, I can see, a strong debate and quite a lot of expanding the agricultural frontier and ring-fencing the rainforests or the Cerrado ecosystems. So if agriculture in Africa continues to develop and reaches in certain countries, I mean, Brazil is massive, but certain developmental stages, like in Brazil, a generation is going to have this debate, how to protect certain areas from the expansion of the agricultural frontier. What can the Brazilian experience, what can African countries now foresee, I mean, can learn now to foresee in 20 or 30 years?
Okay. And I also want Gordon to touch that question as well.
Okay. Can I go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting question. And I think the first thing Brazil or any other country that has this problem now, and try to work it on a policy level first, try to assert regulation and national laws to preserve. I was accompanying a delegation from the Ministry of Agriculture in a convention about 2 weeks ago, and Blairo Maggi, our Minister of Agriculture, said that there's a scientific study that tells that Brazil is one of the most preserving countries in the world. We preserve about 66% of our area. But that's not to say, that's not an excuse, that's not to say that we don't have problems, because we do, especially in the northern part of Brazil, and in the Amazon, and in the northern parts of the Cerrado. So I think it all goes to that ensure preservation, that stimulate farmers to preserve, and to make sure that those laws are enforced. Be the way to go.
Just one suggestion, and that is the role of agroforestry, which Patrick raised earlier on. There is a potential for using agroforestry as a buffer between your naturally preserved areas, your nature reserves, if you like, and the more intensive row cropping that comes the other side. And that's not going to be easy, but there is a kind of transition in agroforestry between row cropping and the forest itself. You'd have to let it possible.
Thank you. Question. And I'd just like to tell the audience that I'll be coming back to one of the questions that I asked to track if there's been any change in your thinking. Question?
My name is Miguel Ángel Rodriguez. I'm a former president of Costa Rica and Central America. And this question comes very near to me by my personal experience and my country experience. We experienced a period of time in which we were given incentives to cattle grazing, and we lost a large part of our forestry. Since then, 20, 30 years ago, we started a program to try to recoup our vegetable coverture. And now we have around vegetable coverture in the country. 27% of all our territory is preserved, either by the government own the land and keeping it completely out of other uses, or by having taxes that are paid by those who pollute by using petrol, oil, and giving this to the people that have land and made the contract not to touch the forest and to maintain the forest. And we have gained a lot with this, not only in the quality of our country, but also by ecotourism that is now a very prosperous industry in the country. So that I think that this experience should be good to look at it, because it shows that we made big mistakes for many years, and we were able to change the way we're doing things and have a more good attitude toward preservation of nature that has paid and has been in our benefit.
Mr. President, please hold the mic. I just want to ask you, this certainly did not happen overnight, and there may or may not have been a political price to pay. How difficult was it to make that happen?
At the beginning, it was very difficult. The people who lived in the areas where the agricultural frontier was growing wanted to keep it growing. They were not living in very good, but they were used to taking a piece of land and taking down the forest and planting some corn and about around that. And they were very much against. But it was a process in which different political parties came together to think that this was something that we had to change. As when I was an entrepreneur, an agri-industrial entrepreneur, I was given subsidies to cut the trees. If I bought a tractor to go and take down the trees, I will pay no taxes, and I will have a subsidized interest rate. If I buy the same tractor to build a road, I will have to pay taxes and higher interest rates to take down the forest. But then we start looking at this as something that was against the system, and was to give incentives to replant, to plant forest, to plant the trees. And little by little, this was going on changing, and now the people that are friendlier to the national parks and to the preserve zones are the peasants that live around, because they have much better jobs, working in jobs related to the tourism industry or to some other things than they used to have living of planting corn.
Mr. Minister, I mean, you heard what the president have an important position in a country that has severe issues, poverty among others. I mean, how will be as successful as what we saw in Costa Rica?
Yes, with the right policies and the right priorities, we can achieve it, as I said. That's why I think the governments of Africa has to have their right priority, their priorities right in trying to solve poverty. Africa has no right to be hungry. Africa cannot be poor, because we are the richest continent. And one of the main areas in which my sister touched today, I think is one area that's integration. As you said, Gambia is small, very small. But I had, I took up and Mauritania. There is enough ruminants, sheep and goats, to feed all the 16 countries if the offtake is properly managed, and cattle. But do you know, all these countries have very vibrant, some of us, tourist industries, but all our hotels import 87% of their meat, of their livestock needs, because if you want to take a truck full of meat from Mali to Gambia, it will get rotten, because they will stop it in two borders and stop it there for 24 hours. When a truck full can leave Germany and drive to France, or to Sweden. Nobody stops the truck. The same thing in America, from the West Coast to the East Coast. What is wrong with
talking about it? Your reality.
If we don't talk about it, we can't solve it. Africa, we have been compromising for too long, not telling each other the truth. I don't want my kids to suffer what I have suffered.
So what are you doing to make that happen?
I'm beginning with my, we are a new dispensation in Gambia. And one of the things I told my president was, Gambia and Senegal are the best countries to show Africa how integration should start. This is one people, one culture. My grandfather came from Senegal. 2 wives in Senegal and 4 younger siblings. He came and married a wife in Gambia and got my dad. My mother is after 60 years. I'm not saying we can even agree that we still maintain our identities, but the movements of the people and services and goods should be easy for the benefit of the people. The bigger the market, the better for the people. And it creates opportunities for the people-to-people connection. Business will grow. That's what Africa needs.
We'll take our last question.
My name is Francis Anyebu. I'm an emerging leader and also I run a farm. One of the things, we've been talking about technology, but we need to understand that behind all of this, we need to ask a few questions around. Are they resilient? What are people's reception to it? For example, my farm was into production of, we were producing edible mushrooms. And then while we produced that using biotechnology, cultured it and then prepared it and then provided it, what we realized was that people's reception to it was that they would rather have themselves pick mushroom out in the wild than have a mushroom that's produced with biotechnology, as it were. So that was a source of concern at some point. And then additionally, as a way of adding, we can tap into the youth budget that we have on the continent right now. Like most of the panelists have said, by making into that arena, because we feel that it looks more attractive. And then if government can provide this enabling environment by providing the right funding that is required to make it work, at least if to take a lot of people off the streets and also empower them. Imagine a graduate, after how many years of going through the university, getting your master's and all the rest, and then what is that attraction? What will keep you on the farm? What will make you want to go in there? I think policymakers and our leaders, quote and unquote, should start looking into these things. What will make agriculture more attractive for the growing youth budget on the continent? So if you consider these questions, I think issue of food security on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Gordon, you want to talk
yes.
to that pretty quickly?
I think part of the answer lies in mechanization in Africa. You know, if you go to Southeast Asia, everybody has two-wheeled tractors. There's lots of machinery, even for very small farms. At the moment, we've got an experiment in which we're bringing mechanization in from Brazil to Africa for cassava production. Now, one of the great features of mechanization is that young people get really excited about this. If you lease a small corn dehusking machine, which is built by some young people in Kampala, who then, sorry, I'm answering his question. So you can buy a corn dehusking machine which has been built by young people in Kampala and is then leased out or sold out to different farmers around the place. There's also much more opportunity for young people in food processing, small-scale food processing, and in entrepreneurship. I think it's very important to understand just how valuable entrepreneurship is, not for people from high-level university degrees, but, for example, from middle school. In Rwanda, I've seen young people from middle school who've got loans from the Rwanda government, We've got a dozen of them together who are producing and selling seed. So much money out of doing this that each one has applied for another grant from them. Somebody else who's growing garlic for sale. And there's another woman who's decided to use her money to buy a bar, and she's hired a thug to run the bar. So all that entrepreneurship is valuable for young. I'm not saying that all young people should become thugs. I'm simply saying that the idea of entrepreneurship is something that's attractive to young people.
Thank you very much, Gordon. We'll take our last question comment from Obi, but before I do, let's return to the question, if we can return to the voting. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. But if we can return to the voting, and we'll show the results while Obi speaks. I think farming can save farming in Africa. And you will see the three options on voting. I think that technology is still with us. So if you don't see it, then technology is no longer with us. But Obi, please.
Right. Number one thing is that the tension between sustainable management of the environment and food security can actually be dealt with by adhering to certain responsible farming principles. And there are global principles that are emerging to those kinds of principles, because it's the tension between land use, especially preservation and protection of forests. The number two thing is that agriculture was for a long time not seen as business on the continent. It was not looked at as business. It was simply looked at as a subsistence activity that government did something about. But if I asked you which is the biggest private sector on the continent, what would you say? People never say agriculture as the biggest private sector, but it is. Yeah. It is the sector where we have the largest number of our citizens playing. But they are playing at low productivity. What they're doing is how to enhance their productivity. So everything that enhances Africa's private sector. And then we need to figure out how we can connect the smallholder farmers and large-scale agriculture. There is a place for the convergence, for the connections, and for the leverage. Policies can make a lot of difference. If we have clever people making policies on agriculture, they would look at agriculture from that holistic perspective of being a driver for poverty reduction, for increasing growth on the continent, for, in fact, reducing inequalities, being a continent that could potentially be the one having the largest unused area of the world.
Thank you very much, Obi. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and I appreciate your intervention. Please join me in thanking the panel for its great advice. Thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. Well done. Was a good discussion.
Prépare bannière. Dernier. Le temps. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start the last panel of the day immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the last plenary of the day, Mrs. Uduak Amimo. Dear attendants, dear participants, take your seats, please.
Hello.
Where?
Okay. Hello
It's
again,
exciting,
everybody.
a very dynamic city. Very dynamic. Yes, it's. You've been there many times.
Please take your seats. Please take your seats. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Excuse me. Sorry, please take your seats. We'd like to get on with the next panel. Yes, thank you. Sorry, take your, yeah. So we do need to, it is me, you're leaving. And you're leaving me, is that what you're telling me? No, okay, thank you. No, thanks. Oh, thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, oh, thank you. Sorry, could I get you to settle down, please? We're starting the next session. Thank you. Sorry?
The last session is always the most difficult.
I hope you're not tired. I think it's first day we are okay. Right? So we need partners here. I just hired someone from the African Development Bank for my team there. She's arriving next month. I take care of strategy and the partnerships. On the partnership side, I think there's a lot to do so that we'll talk a little bit about that we get the understanding of every country.
Where is the bell?
Because we use country systems. We don't use and that's tricky. It's good, but it's tricky how to implement.
From Tunis or is here? Is in this pocket.
Ring the bell inside. Thank you, John. So, if I could excuse you, can I clear this corridor, please? We need to get started. We're behind. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back. Welcome back. You stretched your legs, you stretched your voices. So I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to settle down. I remember you from last year. Martine, if we could settle down, please. Thank you. Great, so welcome back. This is the final session of the day. I can see that you would like it to be over and done with so that you can get on with networking. But we have one more important conversation to have. And again, it's a pleasure to be your moderator for this session, Bridging Africa's Financing Gap, New Actors, Long-Standing Challenges. So we know that the gap is wide and the challenges are many. So we're told by the various individuals and organizations that work on this issue. Convening of the Atlantic Dialogues, we will draw out some action that we can all take to close this gap. So once again, I have the pleasure of interacting, moderating an illustrious panel convened to eliminate this issue. Let me introduce them to you, starting with Edward Shikunla. He's the Minister of Finance for Malta. He's also a Member of Parliament. He's a former Member of Parliament with the European Parliament. He's a former professor. Anywhere, just take your seat. Thank you. Former professor, head of economics at the University of Malta. And he will be followed by, thank you, he will be followed by Didier Akote, who is the president and founder of Africa Search Group. which is, among many things, the largest recruitment organization. And finally, we have Sergio Suchodolski, the Director General responsible for strategy and partnerships at the New Development Bank. Don't be fooled by his youthful looks. He has achieved much, including being a former chief of staff at the Brazilian Development Bank. Now, on your agenda, you'll see that we should have had someone else. He unfortunately missed his flight, and so, may or may not join us depending on how the flight situation goes. So to start with, we have a video overview of this at first.
African countries have suffered from a persistent and widening financing gap. With levels of accumulation of wealth reaching record peaks in industrialized economies, and more recently in the BRICS and Asian economies, and interest rates low, there exists a major opportunity to reorient savings towards high-return projects in Africa, most notably in infrastructure. Identifying and removing the bottlenecks to this investment is vital. What is deterring investment in Africa, even in instances where high returns are expected and political stability is fair? How can technology Africa's financing gap? What role China and the new development banks? How can the risk of investment be mitigated and effectively managed in the region? Are there lessons from the successes of countries in Asia and Latin America?
So we'll get started, and as before, we will start with you. Estimates vary, but according to the UN Trade Organization, UNCTAD, Africa needs around $600 billion annually to fund the implementation of the SDGs and Agenda 2063, our development vision. $600 billion every year is what the continent needs to fund its development. So before we hear from our panel and answer this poll, can we close the finance gap? Sorry, what was that? You need to share that with everybody. Can we close the finance gap? Yes or no? And you have 15 seconds left to tell us what you think. Oh, wow. Oh, well done. Clap for yourselves. Yes or no? Can we close the finance gap? Can we raise 600 billion US dollars? And the rest of you are saying no, we can't, because the political will to mobilize that does not exist. The money might exist, but I'm guessing you reckon the political will does not exist. So we'll come to the panelists. What do you make of that, this almost even split? And I asked them to clap for themselves because we've had experience of voting on polls before. And so from our earlier experience today, we were rather pessimistic about the global economic outlook. And so this is somewhat refreshing for me. What do you think? Can we close this financing gap?
It is modestly or moderately optimistic, and that shows it, that the risks are evenly balanced. The positive and the negative risks are evenly balanced, and once there's hope, we'll just discuss it. Definitely, some of the problems are behind us, if I could say that.
Some of the problems such as?
I mean, if the gap developed or got bigger, we have to remind ourselves that we've just had 8-9 years of post-financial crisis. At least I can talk from a political point of view, from the European experience, where all that time was just concentrating not on development, but navel gazing. I mean, first pump-priming the economy, then trying to reduce the debts, austerity programs. With it, also development was affected. So in terms of attention, both in terms of attention and both in terms of money and appetite for investment, that's the past. Now we can say that at least this year, when we met, the finance ministers of the 28 countries met, we had very good news that all of the countries are started growing, unemployment is falling, employment is growing. So at least from the Western point of view, there's some modest hope that that's behind us.
Okay, let's define our terms, because you know, different people will talk about financing for infrastructure. We're talking about Africa's development needs. So presumably, being an economist, you know, you see different types of financing.
Yes, of course. But it also goes with it, the appetite. In other words,
but what type of finance?
I'm sure whatever figure you're mentioning, the funds are there. But the point is, are they going to be used? So then there are many factors. But at least from the European experience, the banks now are so heavily regulated for good reasons, so that they won't make the mistakes they've made in the past. I'm talking about commercial banks and investment banks. And both with anti-money laundering regulations and financial regulations, they are quite... That's why the European Union is going into another area, which is capital markets union, capital markets. So there are other alternatives. So your question is whether it's the banks or whether the stock exchange or equity finance funding. I mean, my colleagues here would be able to help you out on this. But overall, there must be an appetite. And if you're restricted and cutting mode, you're not in a mode where you're thinking. But there are many indications, I could say, that from a financial point of view and investment point of view, the things are a bit more optimistic than they've been since then.
We'll see if that optimism is borne out. Didier, let me come to you. You work with people, skills. So what, in your opinion, should we be financing?
Well, I think you're right. We need to clarify what type of financing we're talking about. Are we talking about short-term financing? You know, when we talk about SMEs that we support, they need short-term financing to support their activities. When you talk about a government willing to fund a road, a port, or gas pipeline project, they need probably long-term financing. And the thing is that whether you're on the short-term, mid-term, or long-term, the gap is still huge. Small and medium enterprises. They need
Before you do that, I'd like you to answer the question about what we should be financing, because a lot of the time on that, but from where you sit as someone who deals with people and skills, what do you think we should be financing?
We should finance private sector. Why? We need to create more than 12 million jobs every year. And private sector is 90%. SMEs is 90% of the private sector. And they are the ones who provide the jobs. So they need more support. Only 20% of these SMEs have access to finance. So that is priority. When I'm talking about private sector, I can even move to education. We've been talking about skills, capacity for countries today. The private sector in the education sector represent between 25 to 40% support the private sector. So, in my opinion, private sector is the main driver of this transformation of the continent that needs more support.
Where does technology come in your picture?
Technology is transverse. You know, come back to education. In Kenya, for instance, I'm sure you've seen this amazing project that allowed young kids inside the country to access education through their phone, not even smartphone, just basic phone, where a teacher can exchange with the students brings a lot to the education system, or M-Pesa, for instance.
That's our mobile money
Exactly.
system, yes.
But with mobile money, you reach out to at 70 to 80%. Kenya is even more. When you look at Orange performance in Côte d'Ivoire, those guys, they generate 20 billion CFA every day, just through mobile money. So technology, I think, is all the way. And when I say you need to finance the private sector, it's also to finance technology, because it's part of the day-to-day life today, in fact.
Sergio, I'll come to you, because earlier the audience were treated to the expert opinions of a panel that was IMF and World Bank. And so, sitting as you do, you've just flown in from Paris. For these new actors in the financing space.
Thank you. So, New Development Bank and other new multilateral development banks can play a very interesting role. And coming even to your earlier two questions regarding technology, regarding the finance gap, I think that we are one more institution that can mobilize resources to bridge that gap, not alone. We can mobilize resources, not only our own, but also of private sector, for instance, in being creative with interesting instrument where you can leverage a lot of private sector capital with spending very little. In terms of also making the capital that you're deploying more efficient. One way you can do that, and we've done in the past in my previous position at the Development Bank of Brazil, is plugging georeference to...
What do you mean by that?
I mean by that, you map in space where you are investing, different class of assets. You're building a school, you're building a road, you're building a energy generating renewable energy plant, and you know how much you are investing in each region of the country, and some of these infrastructures, they connect to each other, right? They're not in a development plan. So you have a very well-informed development plan for each figures, but the actual impact that you can later on measure on a specific region or municipality or a state of a particular country. World Bank is also doing that.
Okay. So that talks about improving the quality and access to capital.
That says about how you allocate capital in different projects that communicate to each other in a more efficient way, and how you also, across a country or a wider region, effective and intelligent manner. In terms of access, I think then technology can Facebook platform that it's also a bank where you can actually both transfer money and also invest if you want. It's also a Facebook, and stores also have their platforms for selling products there. This is completely disruptive, right? And so very few of my colleagues at NDB actually carry any money on their wallets anymore. It's just WeChat with your smartphones. This could also be used by SMEs for smaller or medium. This can also be used in crossing your data, see what your risk profile is, and you get to a bank, and in a very quick there have a direct impact and can actually help bridge the gap or finance for Africa to use the correct tools to mitigate all the factors that today are blocking the access to capital.
So you started answering this question, is there a finance gap in Africa? Isn't it that the cost and political risk of doing business in Africa are too high? African money is leaving Africa to be invested elsewhere.
I don't quite agree.
You don't agree?
Many years
Why
ago,
not?
I lived in New York, and We were studying, I worked at a private equity firm, and we were studying to launch a fund for Africa. We're just talking about that because we have someone in common who was part of that project. And we had Carlyle, private equity firm based in New York. They have a fund for Africa. Other major players, they're all very interested in Africa because of the high returns, but you have to know how you do it, right?
Didier, what was your response to that question? You seem to be agreeing with it.
Yes, I think the perception is different from the reality. When you look at the numbers, in fact, the projects that have failed in Africa because of political risk are very few. Then people investing in Africa made a lot of returns. And he was talking about Carlyle, Afik Fund.
What sort of returns are you talking about?
I'm sorry?
What percentage of returns are you talking about?
In terms of failure?
No.
It's between 20 to 30%.
20 to 30%.
And the risk, in fact, the way we perceive the African risk is completely not related to the reality. And we need to tell the narrative differently as well. That was one of the discussion of this morning.
Yes.
People making a lot of money in Africa. You know, out of the $22 billion I've been investing in Africa the last 6 years through private equity fund, all of them made their way. So that's a reality we need to tell. Investing in Africa is not a risky investment. It's a very profitable investment, so we need to correct the perception.
So what about the second half of that question, that African money is leaving Africa?
Well, if you still and most of the money that leaves Africa is stolen money. But people who invest in Africa, as an African, they leave the money in Africa. So we need also to make sure that as an African, we invest more in Africa, like somebody was talking about Dangote this morning. So money is now leaving Africa.
But isn't the problem that there are very few very few Dangotes, and there are fewer people still who account for a lot of the illegally acquired funds, which are then shipped abroad. And the rest of us who are trying to make a decent living, our funds don't really amount to much when you compare it to the illegally acquired monies.
Yeah, you may be right, but you know, the African economy is not made of those illegal money from the government and buy an apartment in Paris or in London or wherever. It's those people who do the day-to-day living, who invest in SMEs, who sell products out of the streets. Those are the ones who are making the African economy. So I think it's just a way to see how we can leverage on these people who basically build the African continent. And I'm sure we'll come back to discussion how the banking system can support probably better
we certainly will.
Those small entrepreneurs, those SMEs. It's 90% of our economy. It's not those multinationals that are making Africa big or great again. It's the African SMEs and African entrepreneurs who leave the money in the continent, not these thieves from the government.
Edward, there's several things that got you writing on your...
Well, it's perception now, but perception is not something, you know, you think of by reading the papers, because there are indicators, the ease of doing business, the World Banks, and so on. So if you're at the bottom of the list, you've got a slim chance of getting investment. And if you have a modest ranking, you stand a better chance. And but sometimes it's also the industrialist countries' fault. For example, when it comes to development aid, the EU gives quite a substantial amount, but has very little to show for it. And
in what
speaking
sense?
to ambassadors in some African countries, they feel very frustrated that when they compare, say, themselves to China, for example. I'm not saying that they don't invest in projects or there aren't success stories, but...
No, please explain what you mean by there's little to show compared to China.
Because they support budgets. And when you support budgets, you don't know where the money goes. Well, it goes, but you can't say, look, this bridge is mine, or European, or with a lot of stars and all that sort of thing. While everybody knows how China provides, you know, the project with financing, everything, and they say in a year's time, you've got the keys, and you have a bridge, you have an airport, you have a tunnel, and so on and so forth, or a farm. You know, and that feeds itself on the pouring money down the drain, or that kind of statements which do a lot of been mentioned, perception of corruption, and that really kills and discourages a lot of investment. Thankfully now, as a result of Panama and other, you know, Paradise and so on,
Paradise Papers,
the European Union is moving ahead very fast in not only making sure that the European itself has a lot of transparency and exchange of information, but now is pushing very. And just last week we drew up a blacklist.
Let me interrupt you because I think you were going where. Papers, the Paradise Papers, shown us that even if there is corruption on the continent, on the African continent, unfortunately, we find that there's also corruption in other parts of the world. And so therefore, Africa suffers a disproportionately unfair characterization as being corrupt.
First of all, you know, pressures are being put on financial jurisdictions. So it's not a question where the money is originating, but from the jurisdiction itself. They register the ultimate beneficial owners of companies. You know, cannot have companies of companies and so on, where you don't know who owns what. And unfortunately, in a way, you know, the African countries are now between, how would I say, a stone and a hard rock, something like that.
A rock and a hard
place. Whereby they are being asked to have high standards of governance. So what was before the Washington Consensus, which were macro sort of standards, now they are taken as given, and they are now being pushed in exchanging information, being transparent themselves. So 17 countries have been living 40 countries familiar with, who are on a grey list, and they are on not on a blacklist because they've promised that within a year or 2 years they will conform. So there's a lot of pressure there, which would be healthy for developing countries.
Okay, Sergio, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think it's very important that institutions that are financing, investing in Africa have good governance. Good governance, I think, is the basis of everything. At NDB, we have a code of ethics and conduct. We have a policy. We have a anti-money laundering and corruption policy that is approved. We have a whistleblowing policy as well, and a very strong compliance division that is very effective and vigilant.
How African countries are represented in the bank? How many African countries have access to the financing from the bank?
Okay, so the bank it was founded in 2014, but started its operation in the middle of 2015. So the bank is roughly 2.5 years now, and the founding members are the BRICS countries. So the only African country there is South Africa for the time being, because although the bank is known as the BRICS Bank, and it was founded by the BRICS countries, the bank, in its articles of agreement and more recently in the term conditions and procedures for new members, is open to all members of the UN to become members of the bank. Also, the bank has its headquarters in Shanghai, in China, center in Johannesburg, South Africa. So this is a very strong signal that there's a lot of appetite for Africa, for doing business in Africa. And I think it's very relevant to mention two aspects that the bank is very new compared to other MDBs, which is that the bank aims to
other multilateral banks.
Yes, yes. aims to open with local currency, and we already started doing it by doing green bond issuance denominated in Chinese currency, the RMB.
And what does that do for us?
That does for us because you don't run the foreign exchange risks. And if you look at infrastructure projects, which are long-term infrastructure, well, this is a very key element that has created a lot of problems in the past for countries that ended up being indebted or paying even more than the double of the original amount because of the FX risk that they ran. And the second aspect that is important to mention is that we work with country systems. So the first assessment that the bank will do when it's doing an operation is to work with the local regulation of the country to do an assessment and to apply it instead of having double standards, applying another standard from like other multilateral development banks do that, and that creates a lot of costs and very burdensome. So this is something that we also are innovating in doing.
Please take out your phones, your gadgets, and go to Spot Me, because we hear a lot about the challenges of investing in Africa. And so I'm assuming that there are people here who have invested on the continent in some shape or form. So the question is, what bottlenecks or challenges have you experienced while investing or attempting to invest in Africa? Yeah, if we could display that question. You've got about, just give me one word. What challenges or bottlenecks have you, is the app working? No, it's just that they haven't displayed it, okay? Doesn't seem. Is the app working? Somebody? Having problems with the internet? Oh no, we've been having problems with the internet. So, so let me poll you then, you know, the old-fashioned way. Where are microphones? Okay. What challenges have you experienced when you've, you know, tried to invest or invested in Africa? Just put up your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Anyone? Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Sandy, so I'm from South Africa and I'm from the Africa region. So I can't say I'm an investor in Africa because obviously I'm young, I don't have the money yet. And for being a former entrepreneur, what we struggle with is we get seed funding from donors, typical donors. Grant funding is not as difficult to get a hold of. But then we struggle when we're in growth phase. People are not interested in investing. Well, I don't know if there's a lack of interest or just high risk, but that bracket between 100K to about 250 USD is a very lonely place. And then when you get over that growth phase, and then the people almost want to come back and invest in you at that time because they're looking for the big ticket stuff that's like equity. So my challenge, my struggle is the missing middle. Is I don't feel like there's enough people.
They want to come in for the glory phase.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else with a perspective at the back there? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chica, and I'm a tech entrepreneur, and this really hits home for me. So specifically, the issue is with tech startups across Africa, we are forced to go to the Valley. We're forced to go to Europe to get investment, specifically in the range between $1 to $5 million. And again, once we're in that growth stage, what ends up happening is the banks still see us as very risky. You know, those who are high net worth individuals who have the funds to put into these startups, technology startups, and don't really want to understand, you know, how we're growing and what's the return on investment for them. And so actually turning into American companies. So for example, I got an investment from 500 Startup, which is the Silicon Valley incubator, and I had to change my company from a Nigerian company to an American company. So now as Africa, we're actually losing that potential economic development, because we're now being shifted. And I'm actually seeing countries like China and India, these startups are going to the Valley and they already raised $1 million from their home country. So they come there saying, look, we're not looking for investment, we're just looking for collaboration, versus us, we're now, not only did we have here to raise investment. So that's a really big problem, especially in the tech sector.
Thank you, Chika. That's quite a bit. And the lady in red, that will be our final one. Thank you.
My name is Uzoma Kichiku. I work with a private equity firm in Nigeria that's investing in agriculture. So I think we do have some perspective on some of the challenges that
So go ahead, please. Thank you.
So I think a key one investing in Africa, not just Nigeria, is that most businesses, especially in the middle, SMEs, don't understand corporate governance and how that factors into running a successful business. So with private equity firms who are trying to invest, you're trying to bring in some change. So there has to be a board of directors. There's a certain way to do things when you're running your business that most businesses don't just understand. And also, especially in agriculture, don't have a clear understanding of some of the key risks and how to manage that. And risk with agriculture. And Obi spoke to it a bit when she was commenting on the last panel, that with most businesses in Nigeria who are processing, having that steady supply of raw material to your factory on an ongoing basis so that you're guaranteed that you're going to run at 80% capacity utilization all year round is a key challenge, and we've not seen anyone who has really got an understanding of how to solve that challenge. So that's also a key one.
Okay.
And sorry, just to also comment.
Sorry, we need to move on with the panel. Thank you very much for your perspectives. I'll give you an opportunity later on to share your thoughts with us. And so Didier, you were talking about, as all three of our speakers, we've heard about the missing middle, we've heard about, African access funding. We've heard that they've had to go outside of the continent to access funding, which it seems their counterparts in Asia don't have to do. And we've also heard about, we seem to be quite entrepreneurial, but we don't necessarily have the skills to build viable businesses.
Well, what they said is really typical of what entrepreneurs are facing in Africa, and the SMEs especially. To come back to the cases, for instance, we need more venture capital, because this is typically venture capitalist approach where you need to take a risk.
So venture capitalists will go for the middle.
And you need more what you call mesofinance. Is between microfinance and the regular finance. The continent to support those type of initiative. And third, the banking system is not structured to support those type of risk, unfortunately. So,
what type of risk is that? How would you classify it?
They say it's too risky. Entrepreneurship,
yes, but what is the risk?
SMEs is risk of failing, that the entrepreneur disappears. Let me give you a quick example. In Benin, with the government of Benin and the World Bank, we've conducted a project, and I was leading the project, where we have selected 130 entrepreneurs on processing panel. And basically, the idea was to provide them financial support. But how did provided mentors? We run through the business plans, the development programs, and then we gave them 20% grant, free money. But the condition was, if your business is sustainable, you may be able to raise the 80% remaining from the bank. So we partner with the banks, telling the banks, look at these companies, they're great. We did the job. We can give them 20% free money if you can get the 80% as a loan. And very well. So I think it's just a way to build the system in how you make sure the bank feels comfortable by whether providing a kind of guide. And make sure all these companies are properly registered, you give them some mentorship. And I mean, it's a great example that is working. And
so you had to innovate your approach.
A little bit. And on top of that, to come back to the venture capital, we don't use enough the diaspora. You know, diaspora send more than 60 billion every year to Africa, to like social support.
Health
But
and education.
Imagine if you can get like diaspora bond. And in Paris, for instance, you have a diaspora organization called Club Efficience, who is about to launch a project like this one to take the risk. And I think $60 billion is quite some money.
You've been nodding away.
SMEs in Africa, in Europe, all over the world. And the same thing happens to them, whether you're even in my country, in Malta or wherever, if they go to a commercial bank, they don't lend to them because they're high risk. The risk of failure is high, so they don't lend. However, the opportunity there, the AIB, the European Investment Bank, has a scheme, it's called Jeremy, whereby the member state borrows a substantial sum of money, which is then given to the commercial banks to lend to these SMEs, and the AIB will stand for guarantees. In other words, what the bank will provide. It was very successful, it was all taken up, and we're in the that will provide more that type of financing for SMEs and small entrepreneurs.
So Sergio, I'm sure you have a perspective on this, but there's also a specific question for you. I think the SpotMe app is working now. So if you've got questions that you'd like to put to our panelists, please continue to use the app. And the question was that, you know, there's a general sense that the lending from the IMF and the World Bank, the existing multilateral banks, has been fairly restrictive. So what would this new bank do differently?
Well, first, it's very difficult to compare with the IMF, which is to provide budget support, as the minister mentioned before. In terms of the world systems, for instance, this is an area where NDB, I think, innovates and it differentiates itself from other multilateral development banks, that it wants to help build and reinforce the national institutions, the regulations, work with countries and apply their standards. Of course, doing an assessment, because there will be situations where there might be a lack, there might be a gap in the regulation, and we will work with countries to improve and to provide all necessary support. So in this sense, it's also important to mention why NDB was created, right? NDB was created after a countries trying to change the Bretton Woods institutions, right? For many, many years, they tried to do that. It took a long time. U.S. Congress, for instance, took 5 years to approve the change in the quotas. If you look back 20 years, 17 years, in the year 2000, G7 countries had a share of GDP, world GDP, that was double that of BRICS countries. Now, this year, these countries together, the 5 countries, they are larger than the G7 economies. They have 42% of the world's population. They have territory. So there is a new world that it's there. Are we here to rock the boat and you know, no, we are here to complement. We're here to learn from these institutions. We have partnerships with them. Many of our staff come from these institutions, Asian Development Bank, World Bank. We plan to work with them because the finance for infrastructure gap is huge. It's over $1 trillion. We could create 50 new NDBs and it wouldn't be sufficient, but we can make it different, right? We can be masters of our own destiny.
And we're drawing new questions from you. Does the new development bank really have the financial weight to alter the global development financing landscape? China seems to be interests might affect their agenda.
Very good question. So China has 20%. It's a founding member, but it has So it's a very interesting experience to start this bank where emerging market developing countries are in charge. And each one of them has equal shares in the governance. I think that's the first thing that I should mention. In terms of the ambition to reshape the international financial system, I think we can contribute, right? We can contribute even to reshape the institutions that we, founding members are also members. There are other...
You're contradicting yourself. You just said you're not here to disrupt, but to complement.
Yes.
But what are you telling us now?
Well, you multilateral banks do, but in a very small scale. Can we do it in a larger scale and prove that it works? Local currency is one of them.
Okay. Didier, you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to add that, you know, if you look at the figures, last year, DFIs contribute only to 13% of the project financing in Africa. So
DFI is the French acronym. You mean FDI?
Yes, Development Financial Institutions.
Oh, okay, thank you.
DFI. So their portion is quite low. But if we can, like local capital markets, if you look at the local capital market this last years, all the countries who have when you issue a bond, I mean, after a couple of hours, you have nothing left because you have a lot of domestic capacity. Yes, to make this happen, then count on the others and the DFIs. So local financial market and capital market can be a way. When you look at pension fund, you look at the insurance companies in Africa, they have so much liquidity.
So Didier, let me ask you to come back to that. Let's see. I'm told that the app is now working. And so I've got a second question for you, which is to raising finance on the continent. How would you address if the app is working, please display the question. Yes. No, we've moved on. The app wasn't working, so the next question, which is how would you address So can we go to the next question? Okay, I think it's, the internet is not our friend this afternoon. So again, audience, the old-fashioned way, how would you address some of these challenges? Did already, diaspora bonds, pension funds. What else could we do to address some of the, yes, sir. Can we have a microphone here, please?
Thank you. I think also I have seen that in the last 6 months, I've attended one of this kind in Turkey, then 2 weeks ago, one in Ivory Coast, and today here. I think the recommendations should be sent to the OAU summit of head of states. Yes, because at least in Africa also, we are blessed with 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 countries that cannot each of them sacrifice $1 billion for their continent. If Europe, France, England, America, helping Africa. And really,
so calling upon the generosity of African countries themselves.
Yes, I think also we should really put to them that it's a responsibility and it's an obligation. Because what we are hearing, like what the minister said, the monies that are going to Europe from Africa, as much as they are stolen, we know who the families are. Let us go to them and tell them part of it should be given to Africa. You know, now we should really.
Okay, so that's the second thing. You've talked about commodity-based development, but you're also saying that the Swiss banks, once we recover our money which has been stashed abroad,
let them give it.
Bring back the money. Obi, you hear that, huh?
It belongs to Africa.
That's for Obi, bring back the money. Anyone else? How would you address the challenges of raising finance? Yes, Over here we've got...
I believe Sergio earlier, Rafael Benke with SEBRI. It's the Brazilian Center for Foreign Affairs.
Okay, thank
I
you.
believe Sergio brought forward really a groundbreaking aspect, which is to bring innovation to, I think, going earlier to the question you made on the difficulty of investing not only in Africa, but in other a certain area, a certain region. And I think bringing, I think georeferencing or whatever he brought to the picture brings a huge transformation. It's true what the gentleman said about how much IFIs may contribute or not to funding, but the fact of the matter is, if you are building a power station and you need 50 megawatts to a small town, and you need 90 megawatts for a plant, if you get to know that and you combine more scale and have more viable projects, and hence funding will be easier. So I think this disruptive technology, this gap that we're talking about, investment not only in Africa but worldwide, and this technology is accessible. And you said we only talk about infrastructure in Africa. It's not true. If you talk about agriculture and how much georeferencing is already transforming this for the small farmer, and if we get this big data together and how we use that for funding, this can be very leveraging.
Thank you very much for that. Laundry. Sorry, I'll come back to you. I saw him before you. Laundry?
Thank you very much. I am Landry Signé, a senior fellow at the OCP Policy Center. So I think perhaps one aspect which is missing in the conversation may be the importance, the critical importance of domestic resource mobilization, and how this could also be leveraged to attract both investment or public international transfer. And when I speak about domestic resource mobilization, I speak around three factors. The first is, of course, taxation, but we also have savings, and we have a better management of natural resources through the negotiation with international corporations and profit sharing. So how will you envision bridging the gap in, or fixing the gap, addressing the gap in domestic resource mobilization and connecting it to leverage and secure additional funding from the international?
And you wanted to say something.
Hi, I'm Mary Jean, and I'm an editor with the digital magazine, The Global Communique. My comments are really around the concept of the corporate tax system, where Oxfam, for example, released a report that in 2010, Africa lost about 11 billion just in the corporate tax system from multinational companies.
Illicit financial flows? Or just...
Yes, and also, I mean, there was a conference with the Financing for Development where there's an initiative on the BEPS process and the base erosion and profit shifting, just to make sure that indeed Africa does benefit from the multinational companies that profits from the African continent. So how can the global tax system itself benefit African countries as well?
The country-by-country reporting regulations which are coming into the EU, for example, would help. In other words, companies can't just say, look, we've made so much profits, we paid so much tax, but where? And you'll find that they haven't paid any, say, in Africa. So the country-by-country reporting would go a long way there. However...
So that seals the loophole. So that's one part of the question that you've asked. But there's a second part to the question that Laundry asked, which is, once you've leveraged domestic resource mobilization, and tax was one aspect of that, how do you use that to secure?
Well, I just wanted to finish the previous argument that, on the other hand, I don't agree that African countries in increasing their corporation tax would help. you know, if it's done on a legal basis, some developing countries, that's how they attracted some certain investments. And if you remove that attraction for some countries. So I don't want to generalize, but you know, there is a big push on transparency, which is fine, against money laundering, which is fine, against sales and financial. But this push for tax harmonization, which is being pushed at the European level, but slowly it could even go worldwide. On the that it would be a race to the bottom, you know, and in the US now has started that. But I would be the last person to push African countries in increasing the corporation tax. I'd rather make sure that they do not erode the base or shift their profits. That is important, that profits are not shifted. Say, if they are made in Africa, then whatever the rate of corporation tax is, they have to pay it there.
Okay, Didier, you were on a roll with your various proposals for how we bridge the gap, and to those specific questions around domestic resource mobilization. And I believe you were going there when I interrupted you. So could you please repeat the question? One, improving it, because many of our countries are still below in their revenue collection. And how, you know, once you seal that loophole, you would leverage that to get additional funding.
Yes, first thing to talk about taxation, I think you can have a broader base with a lower taxation to encourage people to pay. Because the thing is that the government relies on the 10% of the companies that are able to pay, and they get them pay the maximum. So it's not sustainable. So people end up not paying the taxes. So I think the taxation reform, it's crucial to make sure people contribute, because it's not too. The second question is the local domestic revenue. That's where come the DFIs. I mean, I have nothing against the DFIs. But if you have like an infra project for 100 billion, and you manage to secure domestic revenue for 30 billion, for instance, and you issue sovereign local bond in local currency.
Yes.
To make sure your local, your citizens don't be afraid of taking the risk, then the DFIs can come and cover the first tranche of the risk. Like, let's say, 20% of the first tranche is covered by the DFI. The domestic investors come in the second tranche, where they're covered by the DFIs. And then the government itself and people buying the bond, and the local banks, insurance company, pension fund, come in the last tranche. So their risks are covered. So it's a kind of partnership where you leverage on the domestic resources, telling people basically, I have the capacity to finance 50% of this project. If you can come on top and cover the risk, I'm very comfortable. And this is what's happening more or less in most of the bonds that have been issued lately in local currency. What is also, to come back to your point,
yes.
You lower your risk in terms of rate exchange. 35 billion euro bond will come to maturity. So countries who have issued euro bond, right now they're like, moving to any rate will get so high that I'll need double of my local money to pay back this euro bond. So raise money locally, domestic resources, cover a little bit by DFIs, and governments could be a response. And then you can involve the diaspora. Diaspora can come in a trench, and so you get all these people together.
Sergio.
Yeah, I think that the conversation here is about how do you create an environment that is very positive for entrepreneurs, for business, right? And I think instruments in each sector is a fundamental piece. So we were talking about tax collection. You can create
what?
such as what? if you go to a restaurant and you ask for a receipt, an official receipt, so that the government is informed how much you paid and they can collect the tax, you can, at the end of a year, use that proceed for different means, including paying the annual fee for your car. You need to pay a tax for your car annually, but now this is going even to other reasons. Some people are even government giving actual money back to people. But in this sense, part of the economy that is informal, the collection of taxes is much higher.
I have a lottery.
Your lottery?
Every week, a lottery of all these tax receipts. And prizes are given.
So this is one example.
There are many ways.
Yeah, it's Corrêa. There are many ways. I'm just giving one example.
So what else, given your experience in Latin America, what other examples can you give us when it comes to raising finances, domestic resource mobilization? What else?
Listen, I think there is a discussion that it's larger than that. It's not only in Latin America, it's a global debate. And it's very interesting because the starting point of that debate that was already around, but now it's kind of structured, is a recent, right, the rating agency. And it's interesting because one of the findings of the report is that multilateral development banks have been extremely conservative when managing their finances, that they don't leverage as much as they could, that they could leverage as high as 72%, which would unlock $1 trillion of capital that could be applied, and they will still keep the same rating that they have now. This is a shocking figure, and I think a very interesting debate comes out of that, in terms of getting that money and that is in treasury and putting it to the operational side.
Okay, so look, we'll give the internet one last chance to support us, and we're winding up now. And so you know what I'm going to do, which is to ask you the same question I asked you at the start. Can we close the finance gap? And so please respond as quickly as you can before the internet dies on us again. Can we close the finance gap? I've got a second question for you after this. Let's see, 4, 3, 2, 1. What are you saying? Can we close the finance gap?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Well done. Yes. So the second question then. When can we close the finance gap? Remember, we started by the UN telling us that we need $600 billion every year to implement Africa's development aspirations. Can we do that in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, or by 2030, just in time to tick the SDG box? What do you reckon? Okay, so you've got just 10 seconds to go. Oh.
Realistic.
So there we go, panelists. So there is optimism that we can raise the money, but unfortunately, the reality of the world we live in reckons that we are going to do it just in time to say something.
Yes, no, I think that it doesn't factor the fact that the continent will generate revenue, because it's quite I wouldn't say pessimistic approach, but it means that we need the 600 billion each year without generating revenue.
No,
so I mean, my opinion is we have to select and prioritize. Where do you invest first to generate enough revenue to cover your costs and raise additional money?
Mm-hmm.
So, when you talk about it, bridging the financial gap in Africa, it's always like we have to cover all the needs at the same time. It's just not possible.
It may not be possible, but hang on, listening to you, the audience feels that we can raise the money. But the audience feels that we just don't see it as a priority. Between 2029 or thereabouts, you'll see a mad rush to raise $600 billion in that year. That's what I'm seeing from this. Yes, Sergio.
But do you think it's really only about the figure, the money? Isn't it how you deploy it? Isn't it how you monitor? Isn't it what kind of environment you are building? I like this phrase from an old movie, Field of Dreams, and it's with Kevin Costner. And he says, if you build it, they will come, right? Mm-hmm. I like that phrase a lot. And I think that, sort of towards the question that the told us about, why not Bangalore in Nigeria, right? Why not, maybe Vale is, there are Shenzhens, there are plenty of other examples that you can build little by partnering with the national government, local government, different agencies, among entrepreneurs, bringing expertise.
So please be aware that you're making your final remarks. We may have started late, but we will finish on time. Okay? Please complete your thought.
No, that's pretty much what I had to say.
Edward.
I think you should be encouraged by the fact that from recent experience, we're seeing that some aspects of development need time, but some others can make quantum leaps in a very, very short time.
Such as?
Take the transfer of money by mobile phone. We haven't reached that level yet in Europe, but you have reached it in Africa. You've gone ahead.
Okay.
It's encouraging to see that in some ways you don't need to go through all these steps which Europeans or North America have gone through.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't apply to all sectors and all aspects of development.
So let me just check that you've got nothing more to add before we close.
No. Maybe just to add that innovation is part of this cycle. So when we sequence it with innovation, like solar panel, for instance, it was so expensive before you couldn't have a solar farm, but right now it's equivalent to gas or natural resources. So I think if you come faster.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your participation. I'd like to thank you for being open to the panel and their extreme shift in mindset and the optimism that you display. So clap for yourselves. But I'd also like you to appreciate the panel. We've had such a fantastic engagement. You've shared your experience, your expertise, and you've created optimism in this room as we wind up for the day. So thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your faithful participation. Transfers to your breakout dinners will start at 7:15 sharp at the Grand Foyer. Please, thank you.